Okay, the recording started now. Took like 10 seconds for it to appear. We're back. More Tim Cain. Temporary buffs. What does Tim have against temporary buffs, huh? God, Tim. Always the hater.
Hi, everyone. It's me, Tim.
Hi, Tim.
Today, I want to talk about temporary buffs.
Let's do it.
And what I mean by that are the buffs you get for a short period of time for having a spell cast on you or drinking a potion or maybe eating food in an RPG. This is based on
Good haircut, by
a
the way, Tim. You look
large
good.
set of questions asked by future Astrominer. I'm going to read all their questions, then I'm going to talk about it a little bit, and then I'm going to go through each question in order and answer it. This is going to be long, and it's going to reference a lot of videos, but that's actually
Tim. 18 minutes long. You gotta get better at yapping, sir.
something I need to talk about after I read you the questions. So let's start. Future Astrominer asked, you have spoken before on damage types and numerical item design, but I have a question on temporary buffs from consumables, e.g. cooking or alchemy, but possibly magic buffs as well.
CC.
How do you design difficulty level of a game where at higher difficulty settings the buffs are needed to get through encounters? Example, potion to speed or food that is giving a recovery buff.
It's a good
2.
question.
If you're using a damage type system, how do you inform the player that an encounter would go a lot easier if they were to bring potions of fire resistance to the fight with the fire giant without informing them too often that they get annoyed by exposition from every NPC that they talk about the quest? Also, a pet peeve
That's
of mine
also a
is when
good
the
question.
reward for fighting the fire giant is something that gives fire resistance and you never have to fight a fire type enemy again. I get that. The third question is, how do you set the bonus from a temporary effect to be something meaningful but not overpowering? E.g., a potion that gives 1% increase for one combat
How do you
round.
balance?
I'm more likely
That's
to
fucking
sell
tough,
if the
man.
effect is too low to be noticeable.
Balancing is difficult.
And the final fourth question is, if you have cooking or alchemy as skills for the player, how do you reward the player for engaging with that mechanic without it being a grind? Please feel free to split this over multiple videos and in any order you see fit.
Oh man.
Okay, future Astrominer.
I should have a drink for this. Like just something to wet my whistle, because it's just like, how do you balance it? There's so many factors to that. Where do we even begin? How do you balance that? Let's go. He's gonna go one question at a time though. So let's get into it. It's getting pretty warm for me though. Let me take this off. Okay, Tim.
That was a lot of questions.
Good
but
questions.
They're all about temporary buffs and they're very specific.
They're all about balance.
So I'm going to answer them in one video, but they're also very deep. I'm going to give one high level question for all our answer that could apply to all of them, which is buff hard, buff short, but players gonna hoard.
Players
Can't
are
stop
gonna
players
hoard,
from
yeah.
hoarding. We're talking about that. I'm going to go through future Astrominer's questions in order. But I'm going to tell you something before I start. I will be referencing so many videos, and they'll all be linked in the description. I spent a few hours putting this answer together because it's complicated. These are very deep topics that depend on lots of other things in your game, and
Yeah, they do.
kind of are predicated on other design issues that you have to make that I've already made videos on. So rather than make this hours long, I will occasionally just go see this video. And I'm going to assume you know what I'm talking about, and I'm going to keep going.
I think one thing to preface is just that there's no wrong design. Like there are games where temporary buffs are great, and there are games where more permanent or long-lasting buffs are better for that. It does depend on so many things, and it just depends on what you're trying to achieve. You know, let's say there's a game where you have food, and you get a buff from that food, but you don't eat very often in the game, or you eat once per mission, right, at like the start of the mission. Well, that's not temporary then. That's kind of, longer lasting. That's lengthier. It could be for a mission that's 1 to 2 hours in length. There might be a game where you're meant to eat more often, or you're encouraged to do so, or you're encouraged to kind of be reactionary as opposed to proactive with your eating or your buffing. And therefore the buffs might be shorter, but they've trimmed down the interface to buff yourself or to eat, like, mid-battle. They slow down the game a bit while there's a radio menu, and it's easier to craft or to find these items. So it's just like Monster Hunter is more like, a bit there is both proactive and reactive in Monster Hunter, but there are games that are more proactive and you eat things before. There are games that are reactive and you eat things in the moment because you don't know what to expect. So it entirely depends on your game's design. Can't really go wrong. It really depends what you're trying to achieve. Yeah, 100% agree. But I guess sometimes it isn't obvious how to balance temp buffs. I agree. It is tough, and I think that it's tough to presume what you're going to need. Even Darkest Dungeon, you had a designer working on that had been in the industry for like 20 years. And even then, deciding how long buffs should be, it just depends on the fight. Sometimes, if your fight length in a turn-based game is on average 2 to 3 rounds, and you have buffs that last 2 to 3 rounds, then they are effectively buff once to get through the battle. But then you've designed a boss fight that is 20 rounds in length or 30 rounds in length, and now the pacing of buffing your characters feels out of place because you have to reapply it over and over and over again. It just depends. Even in the same game, you might want to change up the meta, change up the loop, but that now interferes with your design philosophy behind things.
This is not Design 101. This is not a basic design video.
This is true.
This is an example, a perfect example, by the way, of how very simple questions that new designers may think, oh, that's going to be so easy. It's a simple question,
I
right?
wish.
Is actually has a very, very complex answer that is highly dependent on other things you may have already decided in your game.
Even the
so
audience.
Let's get into it. Let's start with the first question about having high difficulty settings in your game, needing buffs to get through. Now, I did a whole video on difficulty settings, linked in the description. What I recommend doing is take your game, which runs on a normal difficulty, and then do the following. Calculate what the average DPS, damage per second, is of the player versus the DR, the damage resistance of enemies.
There's some really easy ways to say, okay, we have these early game enemies that for the average weapon that the player's going to have is they're going to be killed in 2 hits, right? Like some oinky oinks, some skellies, some some slimes, whatever, the simple stuff. And you're really just trying to create like your own difficulty rating of different sections of your game or different average encounters or the boss fights to say how long before the player dies, how long before the enemy dies with these different attacks. If this big attack is like 1 or 2 shotting the player, do we have the right what's the word for relaying? Are we relaying that attack from the enemy in a good way? Are we showing the player where it's going to land and giving the player enough time to move out of the way? Or does it feel like it's just out of nowhere? And, you could say like Expedition 33 had some of this, right? Where enemy attacks were rhythm-based. And until you learned the rhythm of enemy attacks, you had animation stalling, where you have this long stall up that breaks the understanding of the way a character moves in order to make you think that an attack is going to be sooner or later than it really is. This can kind of feel cheap to players, and if you're just one-shotting the player based on these things, then it now comes down to a memory game as opposed to kind of reaction time skill. You're changing the underlying strategy of winning the game from something that the player can understand, where there is a long attack, but the motions are fluid, so you can accurately assess when that attack is going to hit, versus if you don't know how long this animation is going to stall, you can't prepare to defend against it or to parry it. That all goes into balance too, right? Because that plays into the difficulty or the challenge of a boss fight. Everything is balanced. Even pacing is to some extent a balance issue, right?
You could do this on a wide range of enemies and then decide this type of enemies go here, this type of enemies go here. From the player DPS and the enemy DR, you can calculate the expected number of rounds that you think such a combat would last. Mm-hmm. If the player's doing 10 rounds per 10 damage per second, and the enemy has 100 health
10
And
seconds.
no DR, you expect that to last 10 rounds. Could be a little less,
Or
could
10
be a little
rounds,
more.
yes.
This is just, you're doing pure modeling here. Then, based on the player's health, you can get the level that they need to fight. Because if the enemy is doing its own damage, whatever its DPS is, you can calculate how many rounds it would take to kill the player. And if that's less, based on
Spreadsheets.
whatever the player's health and probably based on his level is, then you know how long that fight's going to last and whether the player's going to win it.
I mean, this is one of the reasons why I never recommend balancing in engine. You know, we talked about, like, I have a colleague, not going to name his name, who balances in engine as opposed to having a master spreadsheet where he keeps this. It's just like there's so many little factors that you will want to have in a way that you can calculate them without those tools. You have to have that master spreadsheet, you know, something to hyper focus. And the master spreadsheet also acts as the golden standard for your numbers. So if somebody messes with numbers, like QA messes with it or programmers mess with it, and they accidentally upload that, because it happens, right? You just forget that you changed a number. This is a way for you to go back through and make sure that you're keeping all of those numbers consistent with what the balancing should be. Yeah, get spreadsheet gang, absolutely. But I think Tim is bringing up just Tim is bringing up the complexities of that balancing just faces, and you know, think of it this way: when you have a temporary buff that does, like, I don't know, 5% more damage if you drink this potion this turn instead of attacking, you have to ask yourself, will that 5% buff result in higher DPS than if the player had just kept attacking instead of drinking that potion? And if not, the player's not going to drink that potion. They're not. It's not going to be worthwhile to do. If it's easier to kill the enemy than to heal, the player's going to kill the enemy. And that's one of the reasons why metrics and, you know, like achievements or keeping statistics that you send back to your, you know, central server is really important, because you can tell, are players actually drinking this? Are players using this? A good example was Darkest Dungeon. We had metrics for all of the trinkets that people were using, or the heroes that people were bringing along to quests. And one of my tasks when I was doing the junior design for that game was to sift through that info and see which things might need buffs or nerfs based on that. I mean, that's very common. And if you don't have those metrics, you're working blind. But you're also working blind before you have those metrics, which is why balancing is not something that you can decide on paper. You have to see playtests. You have to see how people are breaking your game.
What I just
And people will
described
metagame.
is way
There's always a
harder,
meta.
though, than what I just listed. And some of you are probably already going, yeah. Aside from the fact that there are random variables, let's throw that out. You can't do anything about that. Just assume some kind of average, bell curve, or whatever. Some player damage is very spiky.
Stack more things for the follow.
Meaning the player won't do any damage for a while and then will do tons of damage.
Yeah.
Wizards tend to be like that. Rather than hitting, you know, every second or two, it may take them several seconds
like
to cast
to prepare
their
the
spell.
spell,
And it does
or
a ton of
something, right?
damage.
Yeah.
And it does a ton of damage maybe to a lot of enemies at once.
But the counter is that they're weak, right? Is that traditionally wizards are very weak. They're easy to take out. They might be very weak to, like, ranged attacks. So they're often kept in the back. They don't have access to the opponent's back line. So that might be an okay amount of damage to do here and there to the front line of the enemy, and it's balanced out by other factors. So even just, you know, for balance, it's like, it's okay that this is doing a lot of damage. And it's one of, you know, I just said it, like, there's always a meta. But one of the ways that I balance is if the meta, especially in Darkest Dungeon, this was the case, if the meta is so much work to achieve, then it isn't unbalanced, right? If it takes the player every little bit of skill and knowledge and collecting the trinkets and all the different buffs and items that they need to wipe the floor with the enemies, then it's not like they're overpowered for no reason. They're overpowered because they played the game exactly how they should be playing. It's a strategy game. They strategized. They won the strategy. They should feel powerful. They should be rewarded for that. And if you nerf it, now there's no incentive to strategize, because especially there's no incentive because people will think that if they find a new way to break the game, they're going to be punished for breaking the game. The question is, at least the one that I ask, is was this, did they put in the effort to break the game? Or was this just something that they equipped or accidentally drank this potion or didn't think that it would be powerful and was too powerful? Or did they really sit there and metagame, spreadsheet the shit out of it, load up path of not path of exile. What's the program called? You guys know what I mean. If you guys play PoE, you know the name of the thing. My brain's dead today.
That's described as spiky because they do nothing or very little and then a ton. Player damage is also highly dependent on items they're carrying and what their skill levels are, which means they're also probably dependent on the player's level. I already assumed the player's health is going to be dependent on their level, but now their damage output is probably based on their level too. Meanwhile, when you're calculating enemies, and I just called it DR, I called it damage resistance. Well, it may be damage resistance, which is incoming damage has a percentage of it removed, or it may be damage threshold, meaning any damage below a certain threshold just doesn't happen to the enemy. They may be able to block incoming damage. It may be something that they have a chance to block any incoming damage, or they have a chance to block one incoming damage. Then maybe they can't block area of effect, so it has to be one single targeted attack. And maybe that all of those, DR, DT, and blocking, varies by what damage type you're doing to the enemy.
Yeah. I mean, and I'll say this, like, these are all exceptional points that designers and balancers have to keep in mind when balancing. And this is only a fraction of those things. I mean, look at League of Legends. It's been out for what, like 10, 15 years or something? It's been out for a long time. They still can't balance properly because there's just so many factors at play and there's so many weird matchups that you didn't anticipate. That's why I never look to nerf things that are... Number one, I don't nerf things that are fun just for the sake of them being overpowered. If it's fun to break the game and it takes a bit of thought to do so, to me that's just a strategy. You've successfully strategized. Congratulations. Enjoy breaking the game a bit.
So right there, it's super complicated to make those calculations. Once you have them, what you do is you make your higher difficulty adjust those numbers. And as I mentioned in the difficulty vid, one common thing that happens at a higher difficulty is player damage is decreased, enemy damage and enemy DR is increased, and therefore that is a more difficult difficulty setting because it lowers the expected rounds to kill the player, increases the amount to kill the enemy, or it increases what the player level should be in order to have that encounter.
This is true, but I don't like this design methodology. It's easy. I won't say it's lazy, but it is easy to do. But increasing the amount of rounds that it takes to complete an encounter can have a negative impact on other aspects of the game. For instance, if the expected rounds for you to die as a player goes down, basically meaning enemies do more damage to you, right? Then the incentive to use the same skills or consumables that buff you in the same way as they would on easier difficulties now becomes, in some cases, less relevant because you would rather just focus on attacking the enemy. It can have the opposite effect. It depends on game. It depends on the consumables in question, right? Sometimes it can have the opposite effect. I think Witcher 3 Death March difficulty is a relatively decent example where with the harder difficulties, you had more of an incentive to look at the bestiary to see what weaknesses enemies had. And you didn't have to do that when enemies were just dying like this, right? But I wouldn't necessarily say that decreasing time for player to die is smart. If anything, increase time for enemy to die so that players are still going to... I'm sorry, I misworded that. The other way around. Make it so that the player dies faster, but the enemies die in similar number of hits because it makes enemies more lethal. I'm sorry, I misworded that. I caught myself. They use spreadsheets and metrics to balance it accordingly, so League's a good example of how to do balancing to the best of their ability. Yeah, I mean, if you have Riot's amount of money and you can't balance League well enough, there's no designer out there that's going to. There's not many that are going to be able to do a better job. It's just balancing is nearly impossible, especially for competitive games, because there's just so many factors to that. One thing that I do like with different difficulties though is adding new abilities for enemies and making their AI harsher, but keeping a lot of the other things the same. It is way more work to do that though. It is way more work, and it requires testing of that too. And then instead of just balancing across the board, you're balancing specific things now, and you're almost having to balance two separate games. Hey, Spawn, it's reaction day. You look different. I am different. I changed myself just for you.
Then what you do is you base your buff values on those numbers. So you think, okay, if you increase the difficulty this much and it makes the combat expect for the same player level that got through it at normal, they would die before they lasted the number of rounds needed to kill that enemy. Now they're going to need to be buffed. That's how you can make buffs.
Kind of, unless again the buffs aren't as significant, or the time for the player to die is so fast that taking one round to buff means that you can't reposition or you can't stun an enemy or something, right? I don't think it's as simple as there's a perfect solution for difficulty balance. In some games, doing that is enough. In other games, you kind of end up making like a, glass cannon characters or enemies that are bullet sponges, which don't make sense, even though the player can only take 1 or 2 hits. Bethesda does this a lot with like, oh, just throw 1,000 arrows into this enemy before they die, but if you get hit twice, you're dead.
Kind of expected and required at higher difficulties.
New haircut next week, Thursday.
Now, if this sounds complicated, it is. This is really complicated because you have so many interrelated values. By the way, I worked with a system designer once who was the master of Excel. He was a spreadsheet master. I miss that guy. Working with him and figuring this stuff out was awesome.
I want to be that guy.
It made figuring out what temporary buffs and item damage and how much health the player should get per level and what kind of damage output enemies should have and what their damage resistance should be and what happened at higher difficulty settings. All things that you control in a spreadsheet and play with. Turn the knobs all you want. See everything that changed. Amazing.
That is great, but there is a limit. You cannot balance a game perfectly on paper, and sometimes people will feel that your game is just kind of linearly balanced in this way, and they won't feel as if there's something unique that breaks that. You need a guy like that? That's me, Dramox. Hey, Oxymind, you're sleepy. You went to bed 5 hours ago after slamming 18 hours of coding. Don't burn yourself out.
Highly recommended. If you know spreadsheets, break them out for this part. That's me. And this gets into the second question that Future Astro Miner asked, which was,
I can't show you.
How do you telegraph that enemies will use certain damage types? I have a video on damage types. You might want to go watch that. I'm not going to define it here. First off, you need to know that some players need really, really obvious clues. I mean, come on. If it's not obvious enough, fire giants use fire. I don't know why you'd have to have an NPC explain that to anybody. But guess what? This is kind of a tightrope you're going to walk as a designer. Because if a player knows the information, then to receive that information again feels patronizing. But if a player doesn't know the information...
Wolves hunt in packs. Arisen. Wolves hunt in packs. Yeah. I think Dragon's Dogma is a really good example of it feeling patronizing, but it also became a bit of a meme, right? Of your pawns just constantly repeating things. But I wouldn't say that it's great. In fact, I think that a better, more immersive example is something like Witcher, where the lore, the bestiary pages, hints at things that they might be weak to. Even beyond that, I think Witcher 3 had a really, really good quest resolutions and alternative routes to deal with enemies and quests that didn't involve fighting at all. And sometimes were things that you could only presume to be the case, or they were hinted at, they required extra work. That to me is really good quest design. As for like damage types, I think it's a fire giant. If you're playing a game or you're designing a game and you have a fire giant that is resistant to fire damage, and players complain that they didn't know that, I mean, what can you do, right? Let's say you have like damage numbers appearing, you can always have a way to show that that damage number is like a critical or it's a weakness. You can have a character shout out, but then you run the risk of doing it too often. You might have players that just don't care, right? And they're going to use the weapon that's a little bit bad against that enemy anyway, just because maybe the resistances don't matter that much. Like it's a 10% resistance to like a 10% resistance to an element that the monster is going to die within 2 seconds anyway. This is only going to change it to 2.1 seconds. Who cares? And I wouldn't care as a player. So doing that is a little bit silly. But at the same time, I know that people can kind of get upset if you don't have enough ways to split your resistances and immunities and the way for the players to deal damage. Players might feel funneled into using something that they might not want to use because, well, I've put all my buffs into doing, holy damage. This enemy has 90% holy resistance. What do you want me to do? I can switch to a fully physical weapon or to something he's weak to and still deal less damage than I do with my fully buffed holy damage. What do you want me to do? So it's like at that point you have these annoying shoutouts that your characters are doing, and you're already annoyed because you're not doing enough damage to to this enemy that's super resistant. It's annoying to hear your characters or companions go, he's very resistant to holy damage. What are you doing? It's like, I'm fighting. I'm trying to win. Good old NPC barks, yeah. Yeah. What are you gonna do? FromSoft does a lot of unintuitive damage resistance in their games. I think FromSoft does, but mostly FromSoft has a lot of difficult to notice immunities. But most resistances on bosses are, you can still get through it, right? Because From Software games are all skill based. You can get through a fight without taking any damage. So in some cases, you won't notice that they're not taking as much or that they're dealing more damage to you because of your weakness. So I think that the problem exists, but it just isn't that big of a deal in that game. But imagine like a turn-based game where you as a player have to take damage. Like you can't avoid it. And you can't do much to buff your resistance against an attack. Let's say like Path of Exile's a really unfortunate example where there are just like off-screen one-shots or things that are so big and you can hardly avoid it, and they deal so much damage that even with maxed resistances, you'll pretty much be one-shot unless your build is just so far into over max cold resistance that you can tank a hit with enough HP. Like that's silly. That's just silly, and it doesn't feel fair. Dark magic build and win. Yeah, there's some games like that. Yeah. I know that like holy damage in Elden Ring is pretty strong, except for the last two bosses. Like most bosses, you can deal pretty good amount of damage with holy, except for the last two, which have a lot of holy resistance. Pipeline Jam. I don't know what that one is.
Information, and they miss the one or two times the game offered it, they will blame the game.
Yeah. So, hold on. Tim, what were you saying?
If a player knows the information, then to receive that information again feels patronizing.
Yeah, it does.
But if a player doesn't know the information and they miss the one or two times the game offered it, they will blame the game for not giving them enough information. And by the way, this happened to me. I was playing a game recently. You don't need to know which one. I came to a locked door. I know that if I was strong enough, I could have opened it. And I know lockpick could have opened it. But I didn't have a good lockpick skill, and I was out of lockpicks. So since I had neither, I left. I figure I'm not getting into that room.
Yeah.
Guess what? It turned out there was a back way into that room that you could only discover because it was hidden behind a crate. You had to jump up on top of the crate and then look in the little narrow area between the crate and the wall, and you could see a way into that room. I didn't find it. That's my fault. I was being a dumb player there. But guess what? Some people in QA and some people in focus groups will completely blame level design. They will go, this is stupid. There was a room I couldn't get into. Very few players will. You had to have a really high strength, or you had to have a really high lockpick and extra lockpicks to get in there.
The thing is, I mean, that's a good example because honestly, the developers should change nothing about that. Like, that's perfect. But a lot of developers will change that because Tim is right. When you have those focus groups and they, I don't know, either for whatever reason just miss that or don't take the time to look and blame the game, Tim's right. It's on them. In his case, it was on him. He missed that. He had an easier way in. He went for the obvious way, realized that he didn't have the stats or items, and then moved on without even checking. And I think this is what like Josh Strife Hayes says, which is really smart, is that if basically, I'll paraphrase, but it's a marriage between the developer and the player. And if you as a player don't give your half of the bargain to try and like the game or to try and enjoy it, then don't get upset at the developers because you didn't even come into that with half. They came in with their half. And I think the same can be said in the opposite direction too. You're in a 3-month pipeline for a vertical slice cinematic intro for publishing. I'm happy with the state of ARPGs. Oh boy, you want to compete with both PoE 2 and Diablo 4. Hey, do it. I love ARPGs.
By the way, this kind of feedback is why you see yellow paint everywhere on ledges.
Thank you. Thank you. Tim said it. That means I can talk about it too. Thank you, Tim. Yellow paint is not an accessibility feature. 99.9% of the time. Yellow paint is a lazy way for developers to abide and agree with focus groups and playtesters who didn't take 2 seconds to look. Just don't do it. One thing I can say I really enjoyed about Borderlands 4 is it didn't do that at all, and it didn't tell you where to look. If you never incentivize players to look behind that crate, players will never look behind it. If you show them that this is the golden path forward, and it's marked by yellow paint, they will blindly follow the yellow paint. I'm sorry. The best thing you can do for your game is not to put the yellow paint and let people search. Make people critically think for 3 seconds of their lives, stop with yellow paint. It is collectively dumbing down people, and people are getting used to it. And if you get used to yellow paint, then you expect yellow paint. And if you're expecting yellow paint, you're not expecting there to be any secrets. You like yellow paint just to dumb your audiences? What's yellow paint? Okay, good example. This was one that got a lot of bad press recently. They put yellow paint on all of these crates in the Resident Evil 4 remake on things that you could break that weren't there in the original. This is how it used to be. Best as Resident Evil 4 remake mods. There's one that just gets rid of the yellow paint. Super popular in AAA, like Ubisoft and EA do a lot of this. This way. This is what you climb. Here's the yellow paint to tell you where to go. Because God forbid you get stuck. Or, the equivalent of this is your companions telling you how to solve a quest. Or like, maybe the crystal goes over there. As you're literally in like the first 5 seconds of trying to use your brain. And they're already giving you the answer. And it is because playtesters get stuck or have a little bit of trouble. And in order to prevent this friction, because it is friction that the player is experiencing, this frustration, they put the yellow paint to remove the frustration. But at the same time, by never allowing any friction, you're never engaging with somebody mentally. You're saying you can turn off your brain because we'll tell you where to go. You should have a button to enable hints. I think a button is fine. Like, sure. I just think it should be off by default. Like, Uncharted had a little bit of this too, with like the bird poop ledges. But it just kind of got worse and worse and worse and worse, and started with helping people through difficult areas or through areas where it wasn't super obvious, to now we use it on everything to tell you where to go. Good example of a game that did this really well, Elden Ring. From Software does a great job. They don't tell you anything. When there's a hidden wall somewhere, you don't know. I mean, maybe there's like a message, but let's say you're playing without, like player messages or something, or you don't trust them and so you don't read them. You don't know. You don't know. You might miss things in Elden Ring. I still play Elden Ring and I find things that I never found before. And I've played like 200 hours of that game. I have all the achievements. Beat it multiple times. Still finding things that I never found. Yellow paint works for games trying not to lose sales. Yeah. Yeah, it is very much a casual feature. The thing is, it's just like, it's forced on by default. And in a lot of cases, you can't remove it. There were a few games recently, like Dragon Age Veilguard, where you could remove the yellow paint. I think it was Dragon Age Veilguard. Or it was Star Wars Outlaws. Something recently had it where they removed yellow paint. The problem is that they use yellow paint instead of better level design to show the player where to go. And I think a really good game that shows the player where to go with level design is like Portal 2. Like Valve games. Valve games are incredible with this. It's hard to find like it's hard to find an image of something that is better than yellow paint. But, just lights. Lights. Just use a light. You have a dark room and one light above, flickering light above a like an exit to an underground parking lot in a horror game. That's all you need. No yellow paint. Just let the player look, let the player observe. Think about it for a second. Friction is not bad. The problem is that a lot of bigger companies don't like friction because it filters out the casuals. And they've spent so much money on the game and have so large of a budget that the casuals are their biggest player base. Not you, not me, but the people that aren't on Twitter screaming about games and Sweet Baby Inc. and woke shit 24/7. Not that I do that either, but just the people who are going to spend the money on these games are not the ones that are on social media talking about games.
And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you don't need to know. But this kind of mismatch between the game expects the player to meet them here and the players can be anywhere here,
yes,
is what causes games to get made more casual. Anyway, I like it when a game, to get back to Astrominer's question, I like when a game has the clues you need to figure it out, but you had to ask for them or look for them yourself.
Yep.
For example, maybe like the NPCs won't tell you directly, hey, you better have some fire resistance potions when you go up against fire giants. It's like no NPC told me about the door. I was required to jump around and look for it.
Well, like here's the thing. So if you design that fire giant, because I think that fire giant fight is a good example to use here, where if that's your first experience playing the game, like, okay, here's the tutorial, here are some shitty mobs to fight, some trash mobs, and then here's a fire giant boss. And players go in there with the fire giant, or with the fire weapon that they were given pretty early on. But they also received like a water weapon. And some of them might have equipped it, some of them might have not. They just might have picked it up and continued playing. If the first experience is to, without saying too much, show the player that fire weapon is not going to do very much damage against an enemy who obviously is resistant to fire, you're already encouraging them to think, oh, okay, this is my friction point. This is frustrating because I'm not doing as much damage. What about this water weapon that I was just given? And if you remain that consistency throughout the rest of the game, where the player's expectations are met when they see, oh, it's a ghost, maybe I need to do like, I don't know, light damage or something, right? Because that's what deals damage to ghosts. Just keep that consistency going, and you never need to have this yellow paint or these character shouts. I explained Dark Souls 3's first boss. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Every 15 seconds for a pop-up saying XYZ, it's like I went to an adult website with how many hey do this. That's how this works. Yeah, it's too many pops. It's just you need to set the player expectations, and if the player sees yellow paint and says, "Oh, you're going to tell me where to go," then if you ever have any point without yellow paint, it almost feels like it's breaking its own standards and the expectations that it told you to have. And I think the best thing to do is just not to use it at all. And let players realize that this is a world that they need to explore. That they can follow the main path, and we're going to use some lights, some signs maybe. It's going to be obvious, you know, this is the bigger doorway, this is the smaller doorway, and the bigger doorway is obviously the way that you have to go. But just don't put any of it there. Don't put any of it there. And I think Elden Ring is a perfect example of that. Yellow paint is not needed. It isn't. You don't need yellow paint to sell a really, really deep and interesting open world with tons of things to explore and find, with absolutely zero or very minimal guidance on how to get there and do that thing. And that's exactly why I think that a lot of AAA devs were upset with Elden Ring when it came out. They're like, this breaks every standard of level design. It's like, yeah, but the standards of level design have been deteriorating. Maybe it's time to go back. Hit yellow paint. Stalker 2 is a prime example of this. Map design is key. If you have to tell the player there's a route here, then did Stalker 2 have a lot of yellow paint? Because I don't remember there being a lot of yellow paint in that game. Or maybe it did. I did enjoy Stalker 2 though. Those are lazy, cutting corners. Maybe can we blame them? I don't think it's lazy. I just think it is. It's an outcome of who's playing those games. It, like Tim said, like I said, it's for casuals, and that's not a bad thing. Casual developers are not, or casual players are not bad, but when you have a game that's 200-300 million in budget, meaning you need to make back probably 500 million to be considered financially successful for your investors, you have to make a game that appeals to casuals. Because there aren't enough hardcore fans of Dragon Age left to spend that much money on an old school Dragon Age game. Sadly.
What I would have to do in this Fire Giant example is you can ask the NPCs if you want. You can ask them, do you have any advice? And then they may go, well,
yes.
I hope you have fire resistance stuff.
No, I agree. just put one dialogue option there that says, do you have any advice for how to fight this? And if you are struggling fighting this, who do you have to blame but yourself for not clicking on one dialogue option?
They may also say another party went before you and they didn't come back, so we think they died, so we don't think they prepared enough.
Yeah,
so
and you could go check their journals, and maybe they said, you know, maybe it states some things there. Maybe there are some hints. You know, encourage the player to search and explore. I love that. Love that.
In other words, really drive it home. You're going to need this.
Yeah, Witcher 3's
also,
bestiary was amazing.
Also, if you get near where the fire giants are and you look at the battlefield, there may be scorched marks and burned bodies.
Yeah.
You should be able to figure this out. Personally, like future Astro Miner, I hate killing the fire giants and then you get a bunch of fire resistance potions or fire resistance gear. In fact, shouldn't you be dropping off of frost giants because someone geared wrong?
Yes.
So I totally agree with you. You should be able to get that type of stuff before you are up against
Isn't that classic? Especially like boss fight, dropping a weapon that would be perfect against that boss and you have no incentive to use that weapon anymore. It's like, oh, this would have been amazing for this fight. And now I have no use for this anymore.
Fire giant. And if you sold it or got rid of it or didn't bring it, that's your fault. So 3, buff bonus ranges. I did a video on both skill design and damage numbers, like the actual values of damage numbers and the ranges.
2.
They can be that both of those can be.
2 is a good number.
Everything I said in those videos, which are linked below,
All your damage
apply
should be
here
2.
because you need to have ranges that feel impactful, but leave room for then the buffs to feel impactful.
True.
And this buff range depends on so many factors. For example, what is the range of the thing being buffed? Is it like an attribute that's 1 to 10, or is it 1 to 20, or is it 1 to 100?
Well, yeah, like think of it this way. So you have, I'm gonna draw Tim. I'm gonna draw on your face, but it's a good drawing. You would like this. So you have range of weapon damage. Let's say between, let's say 2d6, right? So unfortunately, you could have 2. You could have 12. Double damage buff. Now the averages are the same, right? The midpoints of these lines are exactly the same. But from a player's perspective, do they want to be drinking their super awesome damage debuff, get a little bit bad RNG, and be hitting 4s, 5s, and 6s? No, probably not. So even something that, from like a numerical standpoint, increases the potential. If the player has bad RNG, then they're going to feel as if the game isn't respecting the decision to drink that massive double damage buff, right?
All of those, a +1 buff means something very different for all of those. Is the buff a number like +1, or is it a percentage like +10%? That also depends on the previous one. If you have a range of 1 to 10, 10% is 1. If you have a range 1 to 100, yes. 10% is 10.
Yep.
So what did you pick for those underlying values? Then you have to ask, do buffs stack? If you have
multiplicative or
buffs
additive
that buff the same skill or attribute or damage output or whatever, do they add together? Or is it something else like the largest buff wins out? Some games even have whatever buff was applied last wins.
That is a really important thing to figure out. And I think, Path of Exile is a great example of a game that struggled with that because they had buffs all over the place. Some were additive, some were multiplicative, some were highest one wins, some had limits, all over the place. Here's your question. Should percentage bonuses be multiplicative or additive? I think it just depends. I think more important than what it is how you communicate it, in my opinion. Because if you don't communicate it properly, then you've made this like strategy game where the player can't strategize because they aren't being given the right information to strategize. Because what you're asking is, I could reword what you're asking. Instead of should percentage bonuses apply to the base stat or only to bonus stats, do bonuses apply to the base stat or to the bonus stats? And players will be asking exactly that when they don't understand it.
Have to decide those rules. Is there, when you have one source to buffs, whether it's a spell or an item or a potion or anything, does it just give one bonus or does it give multiple bonuses? Because that can depend how it stacks. It could be that the individual elements stack with individual elements from other buffs, or it could be one buff wins out. It's the last buff applied, wins out on all of its effects. So you can even do stacking in wildly different ways. You have to think of all this stuff when you're trying to figure out the ranges for both the buff and what it buffs.
Here's the thing, though. I would just recommend picking one and sticking with it. Like, pick something that's really simple to understand and go with it. If you want to have a game where all your buffs are highest buff wins out, literally only do that in the game. And the reason isn't that it's better, it's that it's easier to understand for the player. And if you have this mismatch, this mix mash, if you have this mashup of all these different types and all these different rules to it, and this can only go up to this and can't go above this, or minimum applies this but then doesn't go past this, it's just so confusing. It's so confusing. And it's much easier to say, hey, the buffs in our game, how they work is that the highest buff is the one that you have. That's it. That's the rule.
All this stuff when you're trying to figure out the ranges for both the buff and what it buffs. So I can't give an answer here because it depends on all those.
Yeah.
But watch those 2 videos on skill number ranges and damage number ranges to get a good idea of what to do there. And then finally, The last question was about whether cooking or alchemy, and I'm just
All right.
going to say crafting to be general. Whether crafting, how to make crafting not feel so grindy. I see two forms of grind when it comes to anything crafting. It's collecting the ingredients you need to craft, which may also mean the recipe itself,
Mm-hmm.
and also then making the items. If you want to prevent the collection grind, you can just say, well, what is it about the ingredients that you have to go get? Are they common, maybe even purchasable? And I have a whole video on economy. If you want to talk about making crafting ingredients purchasable, because game economy itself is
I have
hard, and
things to
everything I'm talking
say
about
about
here
this.
depends on that. You can do that. You make them common, or you can say that they only stacked with a limited way in a limited stack. So once you get 20, it doesn't matter if you find any more. You can't have any more in your inventory than 20. This will discourage hoarding. By the way, I have a video on player hoarding, which I conclude that, like save scumming, no matter what you choose to do, some players are going to hoard. Just players.
I don't. Okay, I agree that having an item stack limit prevents hoarding. I don't think that it encourages usage. I could be wrong about this. I mean, and I think this is something that I would love to talk about with Tim himself. But from my experience, I find that having those limits doesn't incentivize players to use it. It just penalizes players for not being able to grab it because they often want to use it at the moment that they want to use it, not when they're trying to perform one part of that loop, the collecting, but are being told that they need to be doing the crafting part of that loop. Now, it's not to say that you shouldn't have stack limits or items shouldn't have weight or that there isn't some other way to handle this, but rather, I think it's a little bit more nuanced. Stack limits exist purely so that PoE can sell stash tabs. Sometimes some studios will bitch that they're limited by tech. Some things, I mean, sometimes, yeah. Sometimes, like, save game bloat or the amount of time it takes to load something can impact frame time. I don't know. It is nuanced. I wouldn't say that increasing storage capacity from 100 to 200 should have any impact on. Yeah, like online games, like sure, like if you increase the potential size of everybody's stash tab and that takes up, let's say, 80% of their save game file, you're increasing it to, by another 50% of that 80, which is 40%. That can have some issues. That can have some issues. What am I trying to say here? Because I agree with Tim, but I kind of also have different feelings about it. Hold on, let me hear it again.
Be hoarding. And I have a whole video on economy. If you want to talk about making crafting ingredients purchasable, because game economy itself is hard, and everything I'm talking about here depends on that.
Well, yeah. So, for instance, I mean, that's a really good thing to say too. Yeah, if you want to diversify the way in which players can obtain crafting ingredients by, let's say, they don't. Let's use alchemy ingredients as an example, right? Like plants and shit, the flowers, gross. Who would ever want to make a game about alchemy? If you make a game like that and you have a different way to obtain those ingredients by merchants or by killing enemies, then players will opt for the option that is easiest for them. So if they can just go to a Skyrim alchemist because they have hordes of gold, because who doesn't? It's Skyrim, right? But it's not that the balance in that game is wrong. It's just that there's a heavy encouragement to just go and buy what you need because it's easier than trying to find out where that thing grows or what drops that thing. And I think Skyrim does a pretty good job of balancing that by saying in this area of the world you can find a ton of it very easily, or you can buy a little bit of it here and there. And alchemy ingredients, you can find those at like stores. And I think they do a good job of making sure that alchemy ingredients are easily accessible. They don't weigh very much. You can hoard a lot of them in your inventory or in a container. They don't go bad. They don't deteriorate, right? And that's another thing that can provide that frustration with the intention of providing the incentive of, oh, I need to pick this flower and then use it right away. That can be kind of annoying for people because, again, Players tend to want to do things in the order that they want to do them, not in the order that they feel forced to do them in. But I do think Skyrim does a generally negative or bad job of especially alchemy training, where it feels grindy because you're not creating potions and poisons that you need to use in that moment. You're not really preparing them and feeling realistically rewarded with lots of alchemy levels for making the potions that you use yourself. Because if you play through Skyrim and you make a lot of potions, which isn't common because the game drops a lot of potions and poisons, you're not going to end up with a very high alchemy level. If anybody who's played Skyrim knows, you need to grind alchemy like crazy. It is one of the hardest, most annoying skills to level up. That's where the issue comes in. It's not the players don't want to make potions. It's that you drop way too many potions and poisons, therefore decentivizing the player to have to make their own. They're a good way to make money, but it's not like you're making good potions that are unique in some way or for quests that generate a lot of money. It's just, I picked up 20 blue mountain flowers and 20 I don't know, mud crab claws, and I'm just going to mix them together because it gets me half a level of alchemy. Just, it's grindy, and not in the way that, grind is just another way of describing a gameplay loop or a sub loop that doesn't have enough variety or interesting gameplay to sustain how many times it wants you to do it, right? If alchemy in Skyrim could be easily leveled up and you often were incentivized to make a lot of potions and poisons because it was necessary to survive, and you didn't find a lot of potions and poisons out in the world, it wouldn't feel like much of a grind because this is now part of the gameplay loop. You accept that you need to make potions and poisons because it is actively incentivized, they are strong, it's worthwhile to do. There's a lot of ways to describe grind like that. But I think that grind is just a different word for gameplay loop that has become stale and boring or overstayed its welcome. You have a good topic to talk about? Diablo 1, what do you think were issues with that game loop if Tech at the time wasn't limiting it? Ask me on Monday, because I would need some time to sit on that. How do you make people enjoy gathering? How do you make people enjoy anything in games? You make it fast, you make it rewarding. Fast is not necessarily required, but rewarding. If going out and finding plants is a rewarding thing to do because these plants are worth a lot of money, then people will enjoy doing it to a certain extent. If you make harvesting plants something interesting where it's not just go up to a plant and press E or X, there's variety to it, right? Like in Colden Chronicles, one of the intention was to have like a hard shell on this like this giant tree, and you had to throw a potion that would break that shell so it would expose the fruit for you to gather. That's different than just going up to a plant and pulling it out of the ground. It's just that you have to think creatively. You have to think creatively, and you have to ask, are we rewarding the player for doing this, or are we asking the player to do this even if they don't want to? Does the player feel forced to do XYZ when they want to do XZY? Click the many swords in Witcher 3 that I didn't use, what happens then? I think swords should have been one of the more rare things to find in Witcher 3. And like you were supposed to collect them and sell them, but at a certain point getting money in Witcher 3 wasn't an issue, or break them down into crafting materials, but at a certain point crafting materials weren't an issue. But a lot of those games that have completionist content are balanced, obviously, around non-completionists. Because completionists are only like 3% of all gamers. So the people, if you make your game unenjoyable for completionists, but aimed at the usual audience that isn't going to do 100% of the content, understandably, people like me are going to feel a bit upset because it just feels grindy and annoying. but I also feel incentivized to do that because you have achievements behind them or certain cosmetics, like with Hogwarts Legacy and the Merlin trials. I had to do them to get all the achievements, but you didn't make doing all of them interesting. You just balanced doing 20% of them because that's what most players will complete. But now here you have this rift, this paradox where you put so many in the game that players don't have to do, but then you're incentivizing a certain percentage of your audience to do all of them, but that's the wrong thing to do. You've now made the game less enjoyable for the people that are the most engaged and spend the most time with your game. That just doesn't feel right to me.
You can do that. You make them common, or you can say that they only stacked with a limited way in a limited stack. So once you get 20, doesn't matter if you find any more. You can't have any more in your inventory than 20. This will discourage hoarding. By the way, I have a video on player hoarding, which I conclude that, like save scumming, no matter what you choose to do, some players are going to hoard. Just players be hoarding. Players who hoard are going to hoard, and almost nothing you can do can stop that. You can discourage it. You can make it almost completely unnecessary, but they're still going to do it.
Yeah.
If you don't want common ingredients that either you can find everywhere or purchase, you can make them uncommon and then encourage exploration in your game. Is exploration a design pillar of your game? Only you know that. You can also make collecting ingredients skill dependent. So you can see things that you could harvest or mine, but when you go to do it, it says your skill isn't high enough. This can be very aspirational. If you want players to find things and know, I'll be able to come back and do that, or I'm too low level to do it, but this is something cool. I can spend my points and then I know what to do with it. Aspirational is a really important. Putting aspirational things in your game, very important. Is it one of your design pillars? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, especially just with incentivizing players to say, yeah, here's this thing that looks really cool. And if, let's say, like a really difficult mining node, and you know that you can't put all your points into everything that the game has to offer, but you really want to level up mining, and it's shown that it can be really, really rewarding in terms of like money, or you can be part of like the mining guild, and there are, unique specific content that you'll get to experience by delving deeper into that part of the gameplay. That is what Tim says, that that's the aspirational. I play a game and I'm like, I really love mining. I'm going to go really deep into this, and my playthrough of being a miner might be different than yours being a woodcutter, being a lumberjack. And especially in like MMOs, this is a really popular thing to do, where it takes so much time to go deep into some of these skills that you have people that are specialized into that, or that are really good at crafting. And so you can pay them some money, give them the ingredients, and they'll craft a really good item for you. And that's how they make their money. That's how they feel rewarded in the game. And you get to benefit off of that, or being part of a guild that has that, right?
What is your game about? You should be asking yourself this now. The second kind of grind is the crafting grind, actually making the things that you found all those ingredients for. You can do many things here. You can limit how many you can make, the same way you limited how many ingredients you can carry. Maybe you can only carry around 3 of these. Maybe you can only carry around 1. Or you can put a limit based on your crafting skill. This would do 2 things. One, you may not even be able to use some recipes because you're not skilled enough, or you may not be able to carry around many of them because that is also dependent on your skill. If you're not a very good alchemist, you can only carry around 2 or 3 of these potions because you don't know how to carry them. They're always breaking. You've been better at skill. Now you can carry around 4 or 5 of them. Makes sense to me. You can also limit how many you can carry, either by a hard stack value in your inventory, or by the skills, or by encumbrance. Yeah, encumbrance has entered the chat. I have 2 different videos on encumbrance.
We watched them
people
both.
have strong opinions about encumbrance, and no matter which side, what you decide to do about encumbrance, there are some group of players who will hate it, which means no matter what you do to decide how much to limit ingredients or resulting crafted items or consumables, people are going to hate that too.
I agree with Tim. Like, this is one of those, it is just like encumbrance, where damned if you do, damned if you don't. You are not going to avoid player hoarding, even if you do your best to incentivize players to use consumables. And you have this weird paradox where you want to encourage scarcity because scarcity makes things worth more valuable, right? If there's only one flaming sword of Ragnarok in the game, this is rare. This is unique by all standards, and so therefore having this item makes it more interesting. If you can only get 10 teardrops of politicians in the game, then and you have to, you can only spend these 10 and there are 100 different things to spend them on, you have a limited resource that you have to pick and choose your buffs and how it's going to affect your gameplay. And this can also play into replayability, of course, too, right? Obviously, there are more than 10 teardrops of politicians because they love to cry. But scarcity with like consumables just encourages player hoarding because they don't know if at this point where they want to use it is the best place to use it. And they don't know if using it here will make something later in the game much more difficult. And before you know it, the credits are rolling and you've only sipped 2 potions. I mean, how many of us does that happen to? How many of us have games with like stashes and it's full of stuff that we've picked up, might need, and never used? I played Arc Raiders and got really rare weapons that I will never use because I don't want to lose them. And so realistically, the best thing to do is just sell them because I'm never going to use them because I'm too afraid. And I might as well get some benefit in the short term by just selling them and getting rid of them, freeing up inventory space. It's a bit paradoxical, right? Here's amazing loot that you could lose. A lot of players won't use it. And how do you encourage that? Do you say, well, you'll find more? Okay, do they believe you? Will you actually find more? If they realize that the drop rate is 1 out of 1,000 from this really rare enemy, making it even more difficult to find, then they realize that no, I shouldn't sell this. I shouldn't get rid of it because I might not find another one. I don't have infinite time to play of this game. I got lucky, and I should hold on to it and never use it because they could lose it.
Just pick one that fits with your game, and that's the best you can do.
Agree.
As for a reward for crafting, you can give experience points for collecting ingredients. You can give experience points for crafting ingredients. It depends on what you picked above, whether you should choose those options. Also, instead of XP, you could restrict skill increases to what skills were used. I'm not sure I recommend that. I have an entire skill-based XP video. You should watch that to see if you would love to restrict the player improving a crafting skill based on their use of it. Maybe it fits with your design.
He's saying something like Elder Scrolls style leveling up, where if the more you smith, the higher you're smithing. Really, he doesn't like that. I'd have to watch his video about his reasoning behind that. I think the only thing that I don't like about how it's implemented is that you're often doing things for no other use than leveling that thing up. Like, I agree, it's weird to be like a smithing master and you've barely smithed anything, right? That's kind of weird. But at the same time, I also don't like I am a smithing master because I smithed 1,000 iron daggers, and it's just there's got to be some middle ground, right? Or some alternative solution between these two extremes of, okay, I took the time to be a smithing master, but now I'm making the best swords in the game with my only swordsmanship or smithing experience being making iron daggers. That doesn't fit as well as it could.
Maybe it doesn't. But Future Astro Miner, I hope I answered all your questions. They were really good ones.
They were good ones.
And please watch all the other videos that are associated with this one.
That was a good video. Guys, go give that a like. And go give Tim a subscribe if you haven't already. He is the GOAT. He is the knowledgeable beast. And he looks good. What a man. I know I keep talking about how I should contact him and get him on the channel. I will try to do that. I do promise that I will reach out to him. But either way, if you're watching on YouTube, I hope you like that one. That one was probably a bit of a longer one, but a really good one just because it is it's one of those things. It's like design philosophy. There's no right or wrong. There's just this was a good decision for this game at this time. But if you tried to do the same thing today, maybe it wouldn't be because there are other games that compete with it that did that better or showed that there's a better way to do things. So it's a topic that I absolutely love. So I hope you enjoy that.